as the crow flies on the Vance Crow podcast.
Tim Hosler, welcome back to the podcast.
Exciting to be here on the almost 1 year anniversary.
Yeah, it's 2 days away, and you were my very first guest that I had a year ago, and I didn't even plan this, that we would have some kind of reunion anniversary show. The reason that I contacted you late on like a Friday night, I think I wrote you a text message at like 11 o'clock, was I have visions that cities are not going to be able to pay their debts. And we are entering another phase in the coronavirus pandemic, which is what happens when you shut everything down and the tax rolls that you were used to having come in are no longer coming in. And you are the only person I could think of that might give us some interesting, novel answers. So my first question for you today is, do you think cities are going to default on their debt?
You know, a very interesting question. And certainly the potential exists. We've seen it already happen with Detroit, right? Even before the pandemic, Detroit went through some really challenging times financially and did enter into what people would call bankruptcy, although there is no such thing for bankruptcy in municipalities, quite the same way that there is for businesses. So, yeah, it's very possible that there'll be a lot of cities, maybe the ones that were kind of deepest in trouble, or states deepest in trouble, that were attacked by this pandemic and have lost a lot of the revenue they were counting on. It's quite possible that they would have some serious repercussions financially from the fact that the coronavirus and their own efforts to flatten the curve resulted in a severe reduction in revenue and ultimately their inability to make debt service payments.
So you, for a while, were in the bond market, right? You were selling city bonds or helping them raise money. What does this look like to you?
Yeah, spent a lot of time in the municipal finance world. And you and I have talked about this before, but there's an entire industry around helping finance municipalities, evaluating their credit parameters, and long before the pandemic happened, there were already issues conversations around what's going to happen to a state like Illinois, what's going to happen to a state like New Jersey, where the fiscal results were not what people had hoped. We had a really strong economy, and of course, when there's a strong economy and growing incomes, generally that means growing receipts for states. But even with those growing receipts from a healthy economy, there were quite a few states that were having issues with, how are we going to provide the services we want to our citizens? How are we going to meet our debt service? How are we going to fund underfunded pension obligations and liabilities? So really a lot of demand on certain political municipal subdivisions that, need to survive and be well for their citizens to survive and be well.
So if you were in the bond market right now, or if you were doing that same job, would this be an exciting, fun time, or would this be a terrifying, nerve-wracking, jump off a building time?
It's interesting. There's probably a double-edged sword, right? There are a lot of municipalities that will need an influx of capital, and the only way that, the principal way that they do that is through bond issuance. So, things like the MTA in New York City and the trouble that they're having there. They don't operate with a tremendous amount of reserves in normal times. So now when ridership is way down, they still have a lot of costs. So it's not just cities and states, it's also the services and the organizations that provide services for cities and states that are separately funded and financed. In Missouri, we have Bi-State. It runs the buses, it runs the light rail, and when ridership goes down, their revenues go down, and they still have a need to make their debt service payments and pay their employees and manage their operations. So on the one hand, when you have a circumstance like this, people need to raise money, and they raise money through bond issuance. On the other hand, when they need to raise money and they are having challenges associated with meeting their debt service, it makes raising money more difficult. So, I think it could be for many people a fun time. I think for the people, in the trenches managing those organizations and political entities, it's probably not a fun time at all.
What do you think? Are you nervous about the future of the economy, or was $2 trillion enough to buoy us and get us off into the future?
The results of what's happened in the last 60 days are extremely challenging to digest. I don't know that anybody really understands what the impact is going to be. They talk about the idea of a U-shaped or a V-shaped recovery. And of course, V-shaped is preferred because you quickly come back to where you were. U-shaped can be, a big U. So I think the federal government is doing what they can to keep things moving in a way that they need to move. So markets need liquidity, and the Fed is providing liquidity. Companies need, essentially grants, and 501c3 not-for-profit organizations through this PPP loan, payroll protection program loans. Effectively, the government is granting money into these organizations in large part to supplement, revenue declines and help people continue to be employed. So it's hard to say whether this is going to be enough or too much. We don't know yet. The other side of flooding the economy with invented money is you generate inflationary pressures. But for the last, I don't even know, decade, there's been a lot of talk about how inflation is not at the Fed's target of 2% a year. They may hit it this year based on, the influx of all the funds into the economy. But for now, I think the feeling is that they're doing the right thing to create liquidity and provide resources that organizations need to keep people employed.
A couple of weeks ago, I had Dr. Lacey Hunt on from the Hoisington's report, and he came on and said, inflation is not the problem that you are looking for. The problem you're looking for is actually deflation. And he gave a very sophisticated argument for the problems with deflation, but I have to admit that even after his long explanation, I'm still of the mindset that it makes no sense to me that you could add $2 trillion, and I know you're financing it, so you're putting it out as bonds as opposed to just printing the money and injecting it directly. But to me, it seems like we're splitting hairs here, and inflation is inevitable. Why is this not correct?
Well, inflation is all about the amount of money chasing the amount of goods. And if you have too much money chasing too few goods, you get inflation. People are willing to pay more for the scarcity of product. When you have too much product and too few buyers, then you end up with a situation where, prices theoretically are expected to fall. So I think there are, at the margins, at the extremes, there are problems with deflation, there are problems with inflation, and the Federal Reserve tries very, very hard in their work and study and analysis of the economy to make sure that they've got the right balance, that we don't have, too much inflation, which is a problem we suffered with in this country in my lifetime. I mean, I do remember, 15 and 16% Treasury bond yields because inflation was substantially higher than what we're trying to focus on today at 2%. I don't know that I'm pretty certain that I haven't experienced a deflationary environment in the United States to any great degree, but I'm sure, there are examples of other economies that suffer from deflation, not enough purchasing power to support the goods and services that the economy wants to provide.
It strikes me that if you are a saver of money, if you have held on to cash or you've been able to preserve something, that like really high interest rates would be a really good thing. I mean, it would allow you to put your money away and not have to have it at risk, in the same way that right now, the only way I can beat inflation is if I put my money in the stock market and just pray it keeps going up.
Vance, it's interesting, but you can find a community of people who benefit from any economic scenario, right? In my position as a saver, high interest rates would be terrific, but I don't buy as much as I did before. I'm not buying and replacing cars and trying to buy a new house and in products to raise a family. So in an environment where you are a saver, having an attractive yield that, just rains 9% back on you every year would be fun. But, the other side of that is generally that's fueled by a lot of inflation, which means product costs are going up as rapidly as the rate of interest. You don't, in my experience, you don't normally get a 9% interest rate on your treasury securities and a 2% rate of inflation, right? It's obviously much closer together. So, in recent years, when we've had effectively zero interest rates through really most of from 2008 up until almost very recently, rates have been close to zero. The savers are saying, hey, there's no way for me to make a return on my money in retirement. It's very hard. And that's absolutely true. But people who were buying and raising families were finding very little price increases because inflation was low. So there's always somebody who is benefited when you're inside the norms. I think you referenced the gentleman that came on and talked about deflation. That's, we're talking about inflation and deflation sort of outside the norms. So it's not, that might be dangerous for everybody.
What do you think, when do we start seeing the $2 trillion that was put into the market start flooding into the economy? Or maybe it already is by the $1,200 checks that people are getting, but that's only a fraction of it.
Yeah, we've had a very consumer-driven economy for quite some time. And the things that I would read were saying and portending bad futures based on the fact that companies weren't investing. And so, the corporate spend and the reinvestment and the durable goods and, that was low in terms of where, what makes up GDP. And of course, government spending and consumer spending were what were driving the growth that we were getting quarter over quarter. I think the effort with the $2 trillion, the CARES Act activity is to keep the consumer aspect strong and, keep purchasing up. Although I can tell you in my own experience, my wife and I aren't purchasing as much in the last 45 to 60 days as we were in the period of time before that. So I think there's, that's the intention is to inject stimulus money and additional unemployment insurance money and these payroll protection loans to help people keep people employed, to help organizations keep people employed. And I do believe that's working. I mean, in my own experience, I know of a number of organizations that have decided rather than reducing compensation or laying employees off, they've taken this payroll protection program loan, and at least for the 8-week period after their loan, they have resources to keep their businesses, fully staffed and keep their fingers fully crossed that, at the end of that 8-week period, they're going to be able to get their business cranking again and produce the revenues they want to produce in order to make profits.
I was in a message group, and there was somebody complaining about how wasteful they saw people spending that $1,200, right? They were saying like, well, that's just, they're out there blowing it. And it was like, that's exactly why they gave it to consumers and not companies, because companies would have said, let's hold back and see what the future is. And what you wanted to see was that money continue to keep the credit cards paid, the rent paid, and people spending so the economy can keep moving.
It's very interesting, but you know, if you don't have a political bias and you just sit back and look at the CARES Act, it was pretty ingeniously developed over a really short period of time. So I do commend the people that were in the room and I don't know if it was 6 or 56 that hammered out the right outcome, but there was stimulus money sent directly to consumers, you know, the $1,200 per person, $600 per child check. There was unemployment insurance protection so that if you did get laid off, you had, you know, more money coming in supplemented by the federal government. And then there was money injected directly into corporations and organizations by the payroll protection plan loans and other credit and stimulus activity with corporations. So there's a little something for everybody. And I do think that the intention was people do need to keep paying their rent. People do need to keep paying their regular car loan bills and their insurance and healthcare and premiums and all those things. So if we can keep that going until we get our hands around the pandemic, then we have a better chance of fewer people suffering. And I think that's going to be the outcome. You're
like thumbs up. This was the right way to do it. You're calling it ingenious.
Yeah, you know, I think time will tell, right? If Sweden's approach is more sensible than what the United States did, you know, where they weren't as intense on sort of locking people down. But ultimately, you know, whatever we did to prevent as much as 2 million people from perishing from this virus, I think, you know, you got to look back and say it was worth it. If that's indeed what the result was. I don't know how long we're going to be dealing with the effects of the virus or the effects of trying to suppress the virus. I mean, both of that, there's still a lot of uncertainty around both.
My impression is $2 trillion is on par with whatever kind of spending we were doing during World War II to be able to get ready for building battleships and things like that. And you could say, you know, there is no coming back from that. You've made a trajectory change, and you'll never see the end of the way that impacted the world, for better or for worse, right? You just sent us on a different path.
You know, that's definitely, I think, a realistic approach, that what we invested in America in World War II in the way of spending on today's dollars, you know, I think people would argue it was worth it. You know, we're speaking English today and not German or Japanese. So, yeah, you know, it was worth it. The other way to sort of look at the 2 trillion is our gross national product on an annual basis is 20 trillion. I don't know the exact number, but
that sounds about right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So 2 trillion is like 10%, which is a little bit more than 5 weeks, 6 weeks of total spending by everybody in the economy. So if the federal government ordinarily spends X and now they're spending X plus 2 trillion, and the business and consumers spend Y and now they're spending Y minus 1.8 trillion, theoretically, we would be better off as a GDP. We would have more GDP than we would have had had this not happened, because.
But then why not just do a $2 trillion injection in November of 2019? Like if the economy can work where you can just like punch up a bunch of money, why not do it all the time?
I think because the answer is the economy doesn't work if the federal government punches in $2 trillion every 6 months. I think ultimately it does create pressures in the economy that you don't want, whether it's inflation, whether it's credit deterioration. If the federal government, and there are some people that think, oh my God, the federal government is borrowing $2 trillion and they can't even pay back the 20 some trillion that's already on the books. And that's legitimate. I mean, there are people who are really concerned that we're already way over our skis with, government spending money they don't have. But if you look at the possibility of repeating this on a regular basis, then you end up in a situation where at some point people say, I'm just not going to borrow money from the United States anymore because they're paying me back with dollars that are worth less and less and less and less because they're just flooding their economy with money. So again, go back to that inflation, same amount of goods being produced, but now we've got twice the much money. You would expect prices would go up. So I do think it's a delicate balance that, we've had the reason right now to kind of move outside of the norms and the comfort zone in order to fight for our future as a result of this pandemic.
My buddy Keaton Kruger always says over and over and over again, it really doesn't matter what we do because the economy is based on what are we doing relative to the other countries. So as long as they want to buy our debt, as long as they keep making worse decisions than us, then we can keep on this system. And that may be a vast oversimplification of his point, but it strikes me as like, man, that's like playing Russian roulette, isn't it? Like,
yeah, it's a race to the bottom. Everybody in the bottom. Do you want to be at the bottom? I'd say no.
So we're looking ahead. We've got an election coming up. Do you believe that coronavirus and the economy will be back up to a regular world, by November? Or what are you anticipating by the time the election season rolls around?
I know that there's one gentleman that is going to work very hard to see that it is. And I think, in a lot of respects, his reelection hopes hinge a little bit on how successful we are in the fall and what things are happening in the fall. But it's, again, extremely hard to predict what's going to happen. There are an awful lot of variables at play in this year's election that we ordinarily don't have to incorporate into our, analysis and evaluation.
So we started off talking about with municipal bonds and cities and states. And I think even back in our very first interview, we talked about like, how does all of this work? Because you can't just go in and fire the CEO of the state, right? If you fire that governor, another governor pops up and they've still got all the same problems. Do you sell all of the municipal buildings? Like, do you sell what the state owns? How does all this work?
Yeah, well, I think, again, we've got a really interesting case study in Detroit. And if you think about the fact that you have $1 of revenue and you've got $1.60 of expenses, then if you can borrow 60 cents from somebody, you can make it all work out, right? Then you have $1.60 of income and $1.60 of expenses. The problem comes when you can't borrow any longer. And then you have $1 of revenue and $1.60 of expenses, and you have to start cutting the expenses. So the first expenses that were cut in the city of Detroit were the debt service expenses, the cash going out to pay bonds. That may not be fair. I mean, I'm sure there were people laid off and services suspended, but on the whole, the bondholders suffered because the city couldn't make debt service. And the pensioners suffered because the city couldn't make pension fund contributions. And the citizens suffered because the city couldn't provide services. So you don't go down to zero, right? It's not like the city is going to have zero revenue. The city's going to have some revenue coming in from tax receipts and license fees and, tickets being issued for speeding or what have you. So there is going to be some revenue coming into the city funds, the general fund and the other funds that the city has. Then you need to do a right sizing, right? Somebody needs to come in, just like they did in Detroit. They set up a committee led by a person that said, we can afford to do this, we can't afford to do that. We've got this much money we can count on, we've got to cut here. And, they made some, pretty arbitrary determinations based on what rights you thought you had as a bondholder or as a pensioner. They made some pretty arbitrary determinations of what they would take to cash in and deliver it out. That is the reason why you want to elect a governor and administrations that operate with, fiscal sustainability in mind, because it's easy to say, Vance, if you vote for me, I'm going to flood you with money from the state coffers in some variety of forms. And the other gal is saying, oh no, Vance, we have to be fiscally conservative and we have to sustain ourselves. Well, some people are going to vote for the person that says we have to be conservative and sustain ourselves. And some people are going to say, hey, I like the idea of getting, a new Camaro. So I want the money from the government. And you end up in a situation where if that happens for long periods of time and you're not focused on fiscal sustainability, you create dire situations where there isn't enough money coming in to pay out all the hands that are out, and you have a failure. And the next in line, a lot of people think is the state of Illinois. They have had really difficult trouble. The way that they are managed, they have a relatively low state income tax as compared to other states, and they have a relatively high property tax rate. They have extremely poorly funded pension funds. They have extremely high bills due, right? So if you, I think we talked about this even a year ago, if you mow the grass at the state capitol, it's going to be like 17 months before you get paid because they're that far behind paying their bills. And nothing.
And what business can hold that? Like, what business can afford to pay for the gasoline and the labor and the fixing of their lawnmowers to be able to do that? Eventually, somebody will say, "Well, I just won't mow the lawn for you anymore."
Right, and so the state has a way of being able to say, well, so if a business did what the state did, at some point the banks would say, we're not going to lend you any more money because we don't see a way to get it paid back. What the state of Illinois has done and what other states have done is they've said, well, we're going to capture our sales tax. Instead of just sort of using it in our normal, general activity, we're going to ring fence that money and we're going to issue a bond where you're guaranteed first call on our sales taxes. So they're able to borrow more in an environment when their credit's getting really shaky because they enhance the bond so that you're willing to buy it and put a yield on it that they're willing to accept.
Are you willing to buy Illinois bonds?
I don't. At this particular point, I don't know enough about what's going on. Probably don't want to rely on the next 20 years of my life being financed by debt service from a general obligation bond in the state of Illinois.
So one of the things that I think happens as a result of a pandemic like coronavirus is that the Overton window, the frame of acceptable ideas in a society, opens up. And perfect example is, a month and a half ago, if you'd have said we were going to inject $2 trillion into the economy, that would have been a non-starter. People would have freaked out. But then you have this crisis, so people are open to new ideas. My Overton window idea is, let's get the state of Illinois to cut off East St. Louis and sell it to St. Louis, and give it to Missouri, and let us have that manufacturing space, and let us run that part of the state.
While I appreciate your creativity, the state of Missouri might have to be paid to take East St. Louis away from Illinois. I don't think East St. Louis is a huge contributor to the state of Illinois. So, I don't know that we're going to pay a whole lot of money for that land when that land isn't terribly productive. Now,
I think it could be. I think if it wasn't with Illinois, I mean, like, you take a look at that side of the shoreline. People don't realize this. You go over to the other side of the Mississippi River and you look over. It is like being in Brooklyn looking over onto Manhattan. It's beautiful. And there's all sorts of industrialized parks. We're having trouble with meat packing plants. Let's open up some of the old East St. Louis stockyards, and we're going to reshore all of this chemical manufacturing that we had over in China. Hey, let's use all that area. Let's start turning those factories back on. Give it to Missouri and let's put it to good use.
I would rather Missouri buy Alaska. As long as we're dreaming, there's a lot more wealth buried in Alaska than there is in the mineral deposits and so on underneath East St. Louis, I would suspect.
So what is your Overton window idea? When you look around and you say, hey, there's not very many opportunities when you get to take a big swing at doing something different, what's your big swing idea that we need to do, but we wouldn't do unless we were in crazy times?
That's not something I've thought a lot about. The question is very intriguing. I mean, the idea that, what do we need to do? And I guess I would go back to, venture financing. It is so terribly difficult to raise venture capital in good markets. It's nearly impossible in bad markets. Most of the things that we enjoy today in our lives came from somebody's brilliant idea to do something that had never been done before. And then that idea somehow got funded with, bootstraps or venture capital or my rich uncle or something. So I think if it were me and we had the opportunity to swing for the fences, I would take the kind of money that was invested by the federal government in renewable power, which is an important thing to invest in, or art, which is an important thing to invest in. I would carve off a big piece and I would basically finance a lot of venture capital business development.
Through the government money, through tax dollars.
Yeah, it's been done before. At state levels, it's been done. Not with tremendous effective results, because, of course, it's very easy to give money away to poor ideas when you've got a big old pile of it. I don't know if there's a crowdsourcing way to determine, who deserves the money versus, putting Tim Hosler in a chair and saying, okay, now you've got $1 trillion of the federal government's money. Decide who should get it. I think that's probably not the right idea, the right way to do it. I don't know what the amount should be, but there is definitely right now in our world, in our country, tremendous demand for startup capital. And I think that would be a swing for the fences idea. I don't expect it to happen because of the same reasons that the political fallout of putting $500 million into Solyndra. It's that problem. But I think there's a way to manage an injection of venture type financing that could be done a little bit more sensibly, where, maybe it's the current infrastructure but there's just a government contribution.
What about just getting rid of all the accredited investor requirements?
I see.
So for people that don't know, like a guy like me, if I don't have X amount, I don't even know what it is, like $2 million in reserves or something like that, you are not allowed to invest in private funding of venture capital unless it's very weird rules.
Right. There's a few tests. It has to do with a net worth test and an income test. But really, it's an effort to protect people from themselves. So, again, the venture capital, snake oil, there's some similarities. So if I get you to let loose of $100,000 on my brilliant idea, and my brilliant idea, in order to really make a difference, needs $200,000, well, then you've built half a bridge, right? You can't really do anything with the $100,000 that leads to results. So part of this rule of accredited investing is that people theoretically have the wherewithal to lose what they are willing to invest. And the levels are kind of arbitrary, but it's somebody long ago's interpretation of the amount of money you would need to be able to lose in private investing. So I don't know that relaxing the accredited rules is a good idea. And frankly, I think that's why I gravitated to the, swing for the fences idea of having the government inject some of that venture capital, because I'm not sure it should come from Ma and Pa America. I don't know that that's the right place to get the money, although that's a lot of where it comes from now.
I mean, I think I like intuitively disagree with you. I'm thinking through this idea. I think one of the things that we could point out would be, NIH funding going to the same types of people every time. The amount then of the way that grants are given out through universities. I don't think that has meted us the biological revolutions that we were hoping would happen, or the revolutions in physics or these other areas, because I don't think the government is very good at picking. I don't think that they are optimized for picking payback winners, right? They're optimized for some other goal that's not the same way that capitalism is oriented.
I definitely agree with you. And that's why I said I don't think the right mechanism for giving the money out is to make one person sort of the king. And that's what they did, historically in part. The Department of Agriculture was, handing out these funds for putting up plants that make chemicals out of corn, and plants that make electricity out of sunlight. So there were Department of Energy and Department of Agriculture programs that said, we're going to decide who gets the money, picking the winners and losers. And I do think we demonstrated that probably isn't the most effective way to do it. And again, I don't know that I have the most effective way to do it, but I definitely think that when you look at all the parts of the economy where the most good is done for the least amount of money, I think venture investing, it's the riskiest, right? I mean, most of the money is lost, but an awful lot of good has come from those ideas being financed into economic viability.
What do you think during this pandemic people should be paying attention to that they're not? What aspect of the economy or how things are playing out that you think is overlooked right now?
Another really good question. You promised me some softballs. I think the thing that's being overlooked is what the objective was with the government orders. The objectives with the government orders for shelter in place and shutdown, and the recommendations to sort of stem the tide of the pandemic, The objective was to keep our healthcare capability larger than our healthcare demand. And I don't think it was to keep people from dying. I don't think it was to, stop the coronavirus completely. I don't believe that anybody really thought that, 2 or 3 months of sheltering in place was going to eradicate the virus. The virus needs to be eradicated with, medicines and vaccines. And so now I fear that what's happening is that, you're going to see headlines, red state opens up, death toll rises to highest in history. And so that creates this sense of fear that the people who should be in control of helping us make the right decisions aren't in control, and they're making decisions for the wrong reasons to help somebody get reelected or to, accomplish some other objective. In truth, about 8,000 people in America die every day. About 8,000. And in truth, every year, 40 to 60,000 people die in the United States of the flu that goes around. And everybody has an opportunity to get a vaccine, and not everybody gets one. So for some reason, we're not afraid of the flu. We are afraid of the coronavirus. And I will acknowledge that part of that fear initially was because we didn't understand it very well. I think we understand it better now. So I think the thing that, if you were to ask me that question after I, thought on my feet here for 3 minutes, I think I would say, an understanding of what the mitigation was intended to do. And what I hear now as I listen to Fauci and Dr. Birx is we've been mostly successful with what we intended the mitigation to accomplish. And now we can kind of go back about our business. But the fear lingers. So are people going to go to the movies? Are people going to go to dinner? Are people going to go to sporting events? They did all through the winter last year when we had the flu that killed, a certain number of people who got it. And I know that, the mortality rate is much higher here. So there's two things going on. It's like, well, there's a lot more people that have it than we know that have it. And the mortality rate is really high. Well, both of those things can't be as true as presented right now. If more people have it, the mortality rate's lower. And every year, on average, 30 to 60 million people get the flu, and 30 to 50,000 people pass away as a result of it. And it's the same sort of risk class of people. It's pre-existing conditions, it's the elderly, it's nursing, it's the same sort of group of people. So I think we need to figure out how to dissipate the fear more rapidly. And I think that's the whole point of, the testing where you can prick your finger, drop a blood into a plastic stick and it says, oh, you're okay to go outside. I think that's what people would love to see. I don't know that we're going to get to that.
Yeah, I was looking up the statistics yesterday on malaria. Every 2 minutes in this world, a child dies of malaria. 200 million cases of malaria every year. Now, we don't have very much malaria in the United States, but you have to wonder what the Kenyans think of coronavirus when they're like, well, we have this terrible disease and we have these other terrible diseases. And maybe that's a first world problem in the sense that we have raised the profile of our risk mitigation so much because it costs so much to educate people or they have such a high standard of living. But it does seem that the goalposts are moving and we've lost a lot of perspective regarding what kind of risk were we taking every day when we went outside.
You talk about the goalposts moving, and I think that's right. I have a very good friend that I talk to a great deal who's I respect a lot with respect to healthcare matters. And, I said to him, in our lifetime, are we going to end up with science that allows a virus like this to be eradicated weeks after discovering its, DNA criteria? And he says, I think so. I think we are headed in the direction. So now the expectation on the part of people is, what the hell? We've been suffering this with this for 90 days. Where is the government cure? Right? Where is the federal government cure to make all of us, not have to worry about the fact that this virus exists? And boy, wouldn't that be fantastic if we had the capacity at some time in the, coming future to be able to go from, there's a new virus we've never seen before to an antidote and a vaccine in a short period of time because somebody's, tweaking the DNA settings. That would be extraordinary.
Yeah. The question I have been asking people has been, what do you think the world will look like in 2 weeks? But I think that things have slowed down enough that is not that enthralling of a question now. So the question I've switched to is, what is something you are buying now that coronavirus has, lapped our shores that you weren't buying before in January of 2020?
Eggs.
Eggs. Tell me more about that.
My wife and I would go out for brunch every Saturday and Sunday. That's where we went. And we would meet my kids and my beautiful grandson on Saturday, and we'd meet my parents on Sunday. Now we can't go out. So, I've bought more dozen eggs in the last 60 days than we probably did in the last 60 months.
That's a good answer. Well, Tim Hosler, thank you so much for stopping by. You are right now the fractional CFO of a very interesting company that I've known about actually since Keith Alpert started it. But why don't you tell everybody a little bit about GenieCast, because I think it's worth knowing about during this crisis.
It's very interesting that I'm associated with this now. So Keith, you mentioned our founder, Keith Alpert. He has spent his whole life producing events, live events with great success all over the country for all kinds of organizations, large and small. And about 4 years ago, he was doing an event for a company called the Young Presidents Organization. And Julian Assange had just, dropped a bomb of emails on the world. And the YPO audience wanted access to Julian Assange. But the only problem is Julian Assange couldn't leave the Ecuadorian embassy in London for fear of being arrested. So Keith designed a way to bring Julian Assange to this event virtually. He put cameras on the audience, monitors for Julian Assange, high quality audio and video, satellite feeds, and boom, Julian Assange was in the room. And what Keith reports is that the experience he had watching the interaction, people thought it was magic. It was actually better than if he had been there. And Keith said it was like a punch in the gut. He thought, oh my God, people should be doing this. So immediately he started GenieCast to be an organization that would bring speakers into an audience virtually. And we quickly realized that the opportunity is bigger than just speakers, keynote speakers going to a large audience. We started putting consultants and thought leaders and authors into companies to help them consult. And if you wanted to get Simon Sinek, the author of Starts With Why, to come to your organization and consult with your senior leadership, you're going to have to pay a significant amount of money. We're able to get Simon Sinek into your offices for substantially less. And at first people said, well, this idea is never going to work. People won't pay for virtual help. They want the person to be there. And other people said, well, Simon Sinek isn't going to cannibalize his own speaking fees and charge you less to speak virtually. But the 3 years of experience we've proven both of those things to be wrong. The audiences love engaging with people virtually. Speakers love, and we call them genies, just GenieCast. Speakers love not having to travel, love having more of their day available. And so both parties will pay us to make it happen well and easy. And that's really been our model. So we've been learning for 3 years. We've been proving out this concept. We think there's application to what we're doing well beyond business to business activity. We think there's sports applications, religious applications, music applications. Imagine if you think there ever will be another cruise in the Mediterranean. I think there will be. Imagine that you're walking back from dinner and on the loudspeaker they say Tony Bennett will be in the Lido Lounge at 8:30. And you go, oh, Tony Bennett, how nice. We want to go see Tony Bennett. And there on the stage as a three-dimensional hologram is Tony Bennett sitting on a stool, sitting next to a piano, singing I Left My Heart in San Francisco, talking about Vance's anniversary. And so the application in music, in entertainment, we have a cast.
So tonight. You just made a big jump there because you went from being video to three-dimensional hologram. You guys have the capability to do holograms?
We can bring people in virtually. It's really all about allowing people to be in two places at the same time. The form that they are in, whether it's on a screen, live and interactive, or as a 3D hologram, live and interactive, what we're trying to do is develop and utilize the technologies that allow people to be in two places at once. So we're seeing an opportunity to do well beyond just business activity. And that's where we think we're headed. So it's a very exciting space to be in for sure right now.
Well, I definitely, for years, I've known Keith, and then I knew you got involved. And I looked into it and I thought it was neat. I like traveling. I go give a lot of speeches. And it wasn't until coronavirus hit that I was like, whoa, that'd be a really valuable company. So I'm glad you guys are doing it. I'm glad to see you guys be successful. I know you were really busy, so thank you for jumping on here, Tim, and doing this on the 1 year anniversary.
You know, you talked, Vance, about how I was your first guest. And as a result, I know you got off to a very slow start. I've been paying a lot of attention, and I think what you're doing is really spectacular. So congratulations to you on your near 1 year anniversary.
Thank you so much, Tim. You were the guy that got me started, so thank you. All right, we'll see you later, man.